Hello and welcome to a special Town Hall edition of DNET, the Disability Network. I'm Bill McQueen. Today's show is dedicated to the ongoing review of Canada's social policy and how it specifically relates to people with disabilities. The review is examining jobs, training, education, and social security programs. For years, people with disabilities across the country have said that network has to be reformed. The current review, initiated by the Minister of Human Resources Development, Lloyd Axworthy, is taking place in tandem with calls for cutbacks from the Finance Minister. Disability advocates have spent a lot of time trying to find out what the review will mean to people with disabilities. Axworthy met with disabled people from across the country to discuss the direction of reform. Paula Keirstead hosted the discussion for DNET.
How many folks feel that the present social system has to change for Canadians with disabilities? Show me. Good. How does it have to change? What's the problem with the present system and how it affects Canadians with disabilities? Sir.
The fundamental problem with today's system is that it unfortunately joins disability issues with welfare or social assistance issues. The problem with that is that it sometimes traps people within the welfare system. It doesn't allow them and doesn't promote them and encourage them to join the workforce and become independent.
You know, if you're getting disability welfare benefits and you get a job, all of those benefits are taken away from you, so there's no incentive for you to get a job. In fact, there's incentive for you to continue to be dependent on the system.
The current system keeps people trapped in the welfare model because supports for people with disabilities have been hinged to the welfare system, and you have to be eligible for the welfare system in order to get those supports. And the perfect analogy is the healthcare system. We don't do that in the healthcare system. If a person needs a heart transplant, nobody sends him a bill after it's over.
Yes.
And he doesn't have to be on welfare. And I think the difference is that people with disabilities and their supports are viewed as something that you're only eligible for if you're part of the social services system.
Okay. Mr. Axworthy, do you have any comment of what you've heard so far?
There is a consensus, I think, in the country about the need for change. The real question is what kind of change? I think that's the real debate that we have to start developing so there can be some agreement about what kind of formula, what kind of service, what kind of program can be put in place to respond to the real distortions and failures and flaws in the system without undermining the basics. I think we may underestimate just how large and complicated a task it is, because from the federal level, many of our programs are cost shared with provinces, so you have to get agreement at that level. I think we also have to look at how we can generally improve the employment environment for disabled Canadians as well as the programs themselves, and that means moving into things like employment equity legislation, developing different kind of partnership arrangements with business and labor so there can be real workplace experience as opposed to just traditional training. So the same kind of thrust we're trying to take in the general social review, which is to really reinvigorate the whole employment system in Canada, has to be done with an eye as well to the large number of Canadians who have various forms of disabilities but who are certainly able, capable, and highly motivated to work.
Well, we've talked about the disincentives in the present system. Anything about the fact that people are moving around this country all the time? Is there anything that the system does to enhance that or take away from that? Tracy?
I think it's important for people to understand right now that the system that we have is promoting disability ghettos, that people who are disabled in rural areas and in small towns are forced to migrate to the cities, and then they're having to live in special projects. There's certain places which have accessible apartments. So because services are not portable, we're creating these disability ghettos.
Portability also relates to the fragments in the program, so that you can have a series of programs attached to education, but when someone moves to the workforce, you can't carry those support services with you. Or if you're going to the home, in other words, there's a horizontal breakup as well, and that means the whole idea of trying to put it together in some kind of holistic, coherent way is going to be one of the real design issues, I think.
What's happening now is that there is no choice involved. People are forced to live in a particular area, forced to take a particular training job, and have lost that whole area where one can choose for oneself what you want to do and where you want to live. And the benefits of reform certainly will be changing that system to a point where people have the same rights as other Canadians in making choices in their own lives.
So we're going to break away for a moment. Following this, we're going to be looking at what would be the benefits and risks involved in changing the system. Welcome back to this special edition of Disability Network. We're hosting a town hall meeting on the social policy review and how it affects Canadians with disabilities. We've talked about the problems in the present system, but let's talk about the benefits of changing and the risks of changing. Who'd like to start?
I think the opportunity before us is a new national sense of independent living programs where people with disabilities can take advantage of their full potential. We need a balance in here of a program that provides new innovative programs as well as a safety net.
What else do we need to know? Yes.
I think we have to be careful that we're designing changes that don't lock people into systems that are designed for system's sakes, rather than allowing for the individual to be able to describe and determine the kind of supports that they require, rather than trying to fit a system that is designed by someone else. So I think they need to have two things that happen in order for us to feel really safe, and that is that the individual would have the economic ability to buy the supports that they need, and that communities would have something in place where people could go to shop for the services that they need to help them in their jobs, because each person is different.
And the present system that we have is really a crazy quilt patchwork across the country. And you and I know that many of the programs that are designed as training programs for people with disabilities are neither appropriate nor really professional in their approach. So I think it's a marvelous opportunity to spend some good money on programs that are going to be properly designed by people with disabilities, largely, so that they can become independent in their own way.
Direct costs associated with disabilities are something that other Canadians enjoy in terms of their health care on a portable basis, on an affordable basis, on a universal basis from one part of this country to the other. There are national standards to ensure that those services are in place. I think we could make a quantum leap in this country if we could say that that is also true for costs directly associated with disability.
You flagged the term national standards, and I'm wondering what is the reality of having something like that in a country where provinces have quite a bit of autonomy, and especially in some of these areas we're discussing. Okay, Lucy.
Well, I think I'm in a squeeze in a tight position coming from Quebec, but I think I may be the best one to express it. Why should I receive services lesser or better than other disabled people across the country? There should be minimum standard that goes along with for everybody.
Can I ask a question? Just to really put it forward to people here, what I'm hearing is that they would see the need to respect the continued responsibility of the provinces for the delivery of the services, but that we should, at the national level, where we do a lot of the cost sharing, establish, if you want, a charter or a set of criteria nationally that both accept standards but also set directions, like the independent choice issue. In other words, if we're going to cost share, they have to meet that criteria and then let the delivery take place. Is that roughly the kind of direction people see us going in?
Yeah, and I think we have lots of examples in this country where the federal government takes that kind of leadership role, because I think all of us could talk about what happens with regionality of health services as an example. There might be some minor differences, but generally across this country, it doesn't matter where you are, the federal government ensures that you have a standard level of health services. And yet, costs associated with disabilities are, one province may have an excellent program where people can really move forward and become independent. Other provinces have nothing.
I think we need a combination of federal direct services and provincial services. I don't think you can entirely turn it over to all of the provinces and through cost sharing only. You've got some programs are better delivered efficiently through a national direct program. UIC is much more efficiently run through a national program than 10 separate, rival, duplicating, expensive provincial systems. So I would still think we need more research on what programs should be delivered nationally, and support programs should be probably delivered provincially. But those things which are direct transfer of dollars to the individual to give them the power to purchase their own services, I think would be more efficiently delivered to the federal level.
And if it were left just to provinces to design their own programs, without some national standards, people would not be free to move between those borders, you know, and to be assured that they would get the same kinds of services no matter where they lived.
This is very nice if we can dream this way, you know, that the federal government can set standards and their national standards. But I come from a province, Newfoundland, where we have very great difficulty in meeting minimal national standards in many areas. So that crazy quilt that I referred to earlier, the inequalities that others referred to as you move about, the portability that Al Simpson talked about, that's the thing, that's the ideal that we want, that's the benefit that we could possibly get if there's federal-provincial agreement. But it's also the big danger, if there's not federal-provincial agreement, that you will have ghettos. You will have people having to move, not just from a town to a city, but you'll have people having to move from one region to another. You will not be able to get the services that you need if you're disabled, or if you have a disabled child. In a province like mine, you'll have to go to Ontario or Alberta to get it. And that's a big problem.
So on that note, when we come back, we're going to discuss the paper itself, the Green Paper, what it's suggesting, and how it'll affect Canadians with disabilities. Welcome back to this special edition of Disability Network. We're at a town hall meeting here talking about the social policy review process. Now, the discussion paper talks about a lot of things, but what we want to know now is how is it addressing the needs and issues you've raised about disabled people's concerns in Canada?
I guess I've got my own personal situation as kind of an example of, I think, the way something should be looked at. I have a significant disability. I need a lot of assistance from other people for personal care and other activities of daily living. Now, whether I'm living in a nursing home, whether I'm living in my own apartment and getting services from home care, whether I'm living on my own and managing my own attendant care, the funding is still coming from some level of government to pay for that. If you take on that cost and you say, we're paying it, we have been paying it, don't worry about it, it's yours, don't worry about whether or not you're on social assistance, you're going to get it either way. If you can say for technical aids, I'm going to get a wheelchair when I need one, it's going to be maintained, those other kinds of aids, if you can take those things away so that when I'm really looking at work, I'm looking at the things of shelter and utilities and food and all those, you know, normal kinds of things, and we've taken this burden off me, then I've got energy and I've got focus that I'm actually able to look at employment and really pursuing adult life. A real vocational goal. So I think in terms of the goals of that have been described in the Green Paper, I'm impressed with them. But this could just go dead if the provinces don't cooperate in this.
Once we find out what Canadians are saying and we can see what agreement there is in terms of directions, the whole intention is to start a major discussion with provinces. I think we recognize that they are major players and partners in all this. And in the initial round of meetings we had with them, it was indicated that the first thing we had to do was get our own thinking straight. In some cases, catch up to the provinces, because one area that I've had a lot of representation from provincial ministers on is the need to begin putting more flexibility into things like the Canada Assistance Plan rules, which now really provides a certain sort of straitjacket as to what you can do and what you can't do. So I think there's some fairly initial short-term measures that we can take to show good faith and to show progress. The longer-term issue, which is the one we talked about earlier, about separating benefit systems from support services. That's a much bigger piece of architecture in a way, and it's going to take a little bit more time to work that out. But I did use the example, for example, of the Prince Edward Island model that we now have an agreement with the provincial government to provide joint combined single-window funding of both federal and provincial sources as a pilot project. What I really hope, and I mean with this process, is to take a lot of the pilot projects and the papers and things into the mainstream and not simply say there's, quote, a series of separate disability programs, but say on things like employment development and services, these are simply accessible to all Canadians, right. And that therefore the benefit system can be retained for those like Connie who's going to need constant support, but the access to the employment services are simply there as eligibility as any other Canadian have them.
One of the critical pieces for disabled Canadians is actually allocation of training resources. Presently, we have a system where we fund training more and more out of the UI fund. And frankly, what that does is make people ineligible for training. If you're not on UI, you don't get training. Our organization would like to see some targeting of dollars allocated for training of persons with disabilities. And we would suggest that those targeted resources are necessary to move into the labor force, or people are unable to take the risks that we would like to see them take.
I think the big difficulty that many of us feel is that the reform has to be done, but it's proceeding gradually, and the fiscal restraint is proceeding now at both the national and the provincial level. Many of us have problems, I think, in envisaging in a system where many essential needs are not being met now, how over the next few years the changes that we all want to see can really come about when all levels of government are reducing their expenditure in this area.
Actually, that's a good point, and Mr. Axworthy, can you elaborate on that? We are concerned that it's been viewed in the negative image that this is a deficit-cutting exercise and that the words are just idealism and won't happen. And of course, in the positive vein, you've heard from Canadians here, and I'm sure in other parts of the country, that this is an opportunity. How do we explain that discrepancy between some of the present cuts and some of the initiatives you're hoping to establish?
Well, one thing I should clarify is that the various initiatives of the federal government are proceeding in tandem. We've put the social review paper out. The Minister of Finance is consulting on budgetary matters. There'll be a job creation paper being released this fall. So we hope to bring these things into some kind of coherent framework so that they won't necessarily be out of sync.
We'll come back, and now we're going to talk about why should we get involved in this whole process. Can we actually make a difference as Canadians, and how do we do that? And then we'll find out what the next steps are in this process. Welcome back to this special edition of Disability Network, and we have a town hall meeting here on the social policy review process. What's happening with it? Where's it going? And the question right now for this section is, why should Canadians get involved?
I think it's important for people to realize that for people with the diagnosis of mental illness, that employment is a goal. And we've been inviting our members to get involved in their communities in the process. People are unaware of the accommodations which need to be built in, the supports that need to be in place, but they need to be separate from the employment. And we've been getting calls, and people are actively involved, not just in the social reform, but also our provinces are going through mental health reform. And for us, it's very difficult, the fact that social reform is separated from health reform, because all of our disability area has not yet been removed from the health area. And it is a great concern when we're seeing cutbacks in the area of mental health reform, and when people are actually being removed from the institution back into the community, and no dollars following the individual into the community so they can purchase their supports.
I think one of the main reasons why disabled people should become involved in Canada is that for hundreds of years, disabled people have been seen as sick and helpless and needing to be taken care of. I mean, you know, even just to get a wheelchair, we need to go to a doctor. A doctor sends us to a physiotherapist, to an occupational therapist. I mean, the waste in that kind of a system is incredible. And over the last decade, disabled people have come together to develop innovative and creative models, such as the independent living centers, for example. You know, when we started the first center, we took a woman who was in a nursing home where it cost the government $42,000 a year. We put her into the community where she got the money directly. It cost $12,000, and she could hire the people around her. They didn't have to go across the whole city in order to get her into bed or to, you know, to get her into her wheelchair. I mean, first of all, there was a tremendous cost saving. Secondly, her sense of dignity and respect of controlling her life was very, you know, was tremendous. And I mean, these models we have developed, disabled people have developed creative models, and now's the opportunity for us to bring those innovative, creative models into the mainstream and to demonstrate to the government and to Canadian society that disabled people have something to say about the future of this country.
We're a group of people here today representing thousands, tens of thousands of people, millions. I can think of one individual, to personalize it, a 5-year-old girl on the coast of Newfoundland who has multiple disabilities. She gets, because the medical people say that she can't go to school. They say she can't go to school, so she doesn't go to school. The school says she's not coming to school, so we can't provide services for her in her home. The Department of Education says we can give you the equivalent of 1 day per month of tutorial instruction. She has average intelligence as far as we know, probably a little above average. How long before she will lose her confidence and her courage? And what's going to happen to her when she's 16, 18, or 20 years of age?
Exactly.
That's because that situation exists. That's why we have to get involved.
One thing we've learned in politics over the years is that you have much better reform from the bottom up than from the top down. And that's why we've tried to open this up as much as possible. Now, we know there's a time constraint, and we acknowledge that it puts a lot of pressure on people. But if we don't try to meet an agenda, then it will never happen. So, I mean, I have to be kind of tough to force the process along. But we have opened up parliamentary committees. Members of Parliament are holding town halls. There's been over 100 held already, which I think is a remarkable statement. We're holding a series of symposia across the country where we'll just invite sort of Canadians from different walks of life to comment. There will be a major workbook. About 500,000 copies have been printed. Many of the copies are in alternate media, so they're available to those who have certain disabilities. They're available at the Ys, at the grocery stores, at the post offices, at the employment centers. We're hoping that by the end of this year, we'll have a pretty good sense of where we should go. And then beginning next year, we get down to the really serious job of beginning to design what it is, and by 1995 start actually initiating legislation and changes. So there is a forced march, and we acknowledge that, but I think it's also an incredible opportunity for people to say, as you said, not just tinkering, but to actually new architecture.
People with disabilities will be watching that architecture take shape over the next few months. They'll be discussing the plans, and they'll stay involved in the process to ensure that the programs they need are included in the blueprints. We'll keep you updated on developments. If you'd like to know more about the review, call the federal government's hotline at 1-800-735-3551. The TDD number is 1-800-465-7735. Our thanks to Paula Keirstead for hosting today's Town Hall discussion for DNET. Next week, we'll look at the latest developments in direct individualized funding for people with disabilities in Ontario. That's our show. I'm Bill McQueen. Now, here's our address.